Today, our panel will assess the state of relations in the Gulf region after the Iran nuclear agreement and the impact this will have on Arab-Iranian relations and U.S.-GCC relations. Clearly, we are entering uncharted waters. As everyone knows, the Iran Framework Agreement was announced on April 2nd. The ensuing national debate and international reaction have been vigorous and intense. In an effort to bring clarity to this agreement, the National Council conducted a public affairs briefing in this building on April 8th, with a panel of 6 specialists who provided their assessment on the issues and the implications of the Iran nuclear deal. For those interested, the briefing was carried live by C-SPAN and is available on our website, along with our public policy briefing on Yemen held last month, which featured newly appointed Saudi Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Adel Jubeir. It would be incorrect to say that the Iran nuclear agreement is a done deal. What has been signed so far is a preliminary agreement, a framework, for which many technical issues are to be sorted out in the coming weeks and months ahead. In the meantime, the public debate has and will continue to be vigorous, with ratification even more problematic. Just last Thursday, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to pass legislation that ensures their authority to review the final agreement. While many pressures will be on the President to see this deal with Iran through, it is going to be an uphill battle. But we should also ask ourselves, what about our friends in the region? What are the implications for future relations among those who will have to live with this agreement in the years to come? As we know, President Obama will be hosting GCC senior leaders and heads of state later this week. And while some leaders will not be attending due to pressing regional issues and events, this should not diminish the importance of this high-level summit. It is an effort to understand what our regional partners and allies think and assure them of America's long-standing commitment to their security. To be sure, the President has described this framework agreement as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see if we can take the nuclear issue off the table and bring regional stability to the Middle East, unquote. But it also has the potential to rebalance and reshape relations across the Gulf region. So let us hear from our panel of specialists about the future of Arab-Iranian relations and U.S.-GCC relations in a post-nuclear agreement world. Before we kick off, a few housekeeping details. Each of the speakers will have 10 to 12 minutes for their remarks, and in the interest of time, I refer you to their bios in the announcement. This will allow for a full hour of question and discussion following their presentations. On your chairs, you should find 3x5 cards. Please write your questions on these cards and pass them to our ushers who are on either side of the room, who will bring them forward, and we will do our best to respond as fully as possible. We will wrap up promptly at 11 o'clock. To start, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, the founding president and CEO of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, Dr. John Dick Anthony. Dr. Anthony is the only American to have attended as an observer at each GCC ministerial and heads of state summit since 1981. After Dr. Anthony, Dr. Christian Koch, director of the Gulf Research Center in Geneva and headquarters in Jeddah, will speak. He will be followed by Dr. Tom Mateer, executive director of the Middle East Policy Council here in Washington, and Dr. Sarah Vakshuri, president of SDP Energy International, will speak about our energy issues relating to this agreement. Next, we will hear from Dr. Ali Haddad Mahazin, president of the West Asia Council. And concluding, Dr. Imad Harb, distinguished international affairs fellow at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and former senior researcher at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies in Abu Dhabi, will wrap up the panel presentation. So, Dr. Anthony, if you would kindly come to the podium and begin.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third in 5 weeks of these congressional Capitol Hill briefings and seminars on issues of timely relevance pertaining to America's national interest and those of America's friends, America's allies, America's strategic and working partners in the region. The topic of today's briefing is whether Arab-Iranian relations and U.S.-GCC relations after a nuclear agreement. This presupposes that there will be an agreement. I think the overwhelming majority believe that so much momentum, so many assets, so much investment in this process will lead to an agreement of some kind, or postpone further and extended negotiations until an agreement can be reached. So the atmosphere could hardly be more receptive. The moment could hardly be more propitious, given that there is a summit between the United States and the representatives of the 6 GCC countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman, that is bound to take place and scheduled to conclude within the next 72 hours. Now, the issue, I think, for both the United States and the GCC countries vis-a-vis Iran, and we'll let the Iranian perspective speak for itself. We have ample representation here to achieve that objective, is a twofold phrase coming from the Reagan era in the United States, having to do with the then still vibrant Cold War pertaining to the United States and the Soviet Union, and that was namely the concepts of trust and verify. Now, trust is lacking, and with trust lacking, so too is verification. And the trust is lacking not just between the United States and Iran, at least in terms of requisite amounts, although we're working on both sides to diminish the mistrust, the distrust, and the suspicions. There's still an ocean of distrust that is a reality. And if it's not among the negotiators, it certainly is among the American body public. And the American body public is influential with the American Congress, which, as Mr. Pettis said, has indicated it will certainly have a say in the outcome of this agreement, framework or no framework as such. So on the trust and the verification side is deep, and I'll just run through very quickly. We're talking about, even from the beginning, almost of the beginning year of the Iranian Revolution, seizure of 52 American diplomats as hostage for 444 days in Tehran, seizure of Americans in Lebanon by Hezbollah, which was created a year after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in June of 1982, as an Iranian representative, supportive, aligned element inside of Lebanon. Fast forward to the Khobar Towers attack in 1986 in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Include as well the Operation Earnest Will, whereby the United States put its flag on Kuwait's tankers in order for the energy ships to enter and exit the Gulf that otherwise were being threatened by Iranian attacks. Indeed, Iran, by my arithmetic, attacked the vessels of some 9 countries. 3 of those vessels were even carrying Iranian oil. So this is how that situation got out of whack. And the United States had to engage in UN Resolution 598 of July 15th, 1987, calling for an immediate ceasefire. Iraq accepted it immediately. Iran took 13 months to accept it, with the Ayatollah Khomeini saying he would have rather drank poison there, but that war was prolonged and life and limb was lost on all sides to no one's net benefit. In terms of the GCC countries, with the exception of Oman, and one cannot extrapolate from the good relations between Iran and Oman to the 5 other countries in the Gulf, whether northern end of the Gulf or southern end of the Gulf. Each and every one of the other 5 has a file, and it's not a thin one, it's a rather thick one, of incidents, of intrusions, of interferences in their domestic affairs. Throughout the 1980s, well into the 1990s, and even if one wants to cast further afield, as Dr. Harb and some others will, regarding Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, to this day and moment. So the question of trust and verification will be massive, deep, and pervasive on both the U.S. side and the GCCC side. Now, what has to be entrusted? What has to be verified? There will be more specificity of detail in the remarks of others, but the number of centrifuges that Iran will be allowed to retain and the rationale, the justification, and the acceptability of all of the concerned parties that this is a legitimate number, it's a fair number, it's an acceptable number, it's a number that can be verified with. This alone is a contentious issue laced with implications for war and peace in the region. Secondly, has to do with inspections. At first, Iranian representatives saying that they would agree to all inspections, anywhere, at any time, everywhere, only to have representatives of the Iranian military to say, at military bases? No, indeed, no sirree, not at military bases. Well, that raises the question then, if one cannot inspect Iran's military bases, which is required by Iran, saying that you can go anywhere and everywhere at any time, where is the trust, where is the verification that something illicit is not being stored, built, researched, hidden on one or more of those military bases? So that brings trust and verification full square as well. And then the uses to which the enriched uranium is to be put, yes, for medical research and related research, research that would benefit the people of Iran. But who determines what's legitimate, what's illicit, what's in a gray area, and what's prohibited and what's permitted? That too would turn heavily on notions of trust and verification. So these are the main issues among the parties, the United States and the GCC countries on one hand, Iran on the other, but also with implications to a nuclear agreement that's already been entered into, namely the 123 agreement of the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is officially, formally, credibly on record as saying we will not engage in any enrichment. And the degree to which we use enriched uranium for our peaceful purposes, once we have bought or borrowed, rented the rods to produce that enrichment, we will return those rods to the source from which we rented them or purchased them. So what will be the reaction of the United Arab Emirates to a framework or beyond agreement with Iran that has provisions in it that the population of the United Arab Emirates would legitimately say, me too, or we too. Why do we not have the same rights, privileges, and permissions for our agreement? We must too go back to the negotiating table. And what about the dozens of other countries that have notions of having nuclear agreements or nuclear power or enriched uranium of one kind or another with the implications? What will be their reactions and the implications and the ramifications of such a framework and beyond agreement when and if it is signed? And what will this summit that is taking place now do, if anything, to assuage the legitimate suspicions about a possible massive realignment of American strategic priorities in this region of the Gulf with its 8 countries, 6 of whom are aligned with the United States and vice versa, but Iraq is off the table for the most part, and Iran is a glaring question mark. These are the issues. Those are my 10 minutes, not 12. Thank you.
Go ahead. Roll right down. Hold up.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I specifically, of course, want to thank the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations for having invited me and given me this platform. I want to sort of focus on 3 themes or 3 main issues. One is to look at, give you a little bit of perspective from the GCC states. When you're looking at the security situation in the region, focus a little bit on where we are with ties with Iran and the relationship, and then also what that means a little bit for US-GCC relations. I think from the very beginning, you have to put yourself in the position of seeing what's happening in the entire Middle East. If you're sitting in Riyadh, for example, you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, and you see that basically every single major geostrategic threat that you've always feared is happening, almost. I mean, on all fronts. We see popular street revolt happening as part of the Arab Spring. This notion is asking for greater democratic pluralism. We see the rise of militias and non-state actors, whether it's in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen. We see militant Salafist, Takfiri movements coming about. We've already had an attack now on the Saudi-Iraq border. Of course, here for the Gulf states, still the experience, especially in Saudi Arabia in 2003 and 2004, when we had a number of attacks happening inside the kingdom, is still very much fresh on your mind. We see political Islam as a whole take on a higher level of importance, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then we see this fragmentation of states happening throughout the region, and the Gulf states are still very much holding on to this idea of the nation state as a coherent unit, as a stable unit of international relations. Now we see all the states, they are falling apart. And then on top of that, you see Iran trying to take advantage a little bit of this situation, of trying to contribute to this further decay of the state system in the region by supporting various militias and not really contributing to bringing back degrees of stability. And some of these issues have really hit quite close to home. I mean, we see the protests in Bahrain, and we see the continuing situation there, which has not been resolved satisfactorily at all. And of course, more recently, we see the situation in Yemen, where again there was simply this fear. And I think you have to understand a little bit how the GCC states see what is happening in a neighboring country like Bahrain or in Yemen. It's not that there's a feeling here that Iran is suddenly going to establish themselves as the power in these countries, but it's simply the fear that if the situation deteriorates further, and if we see protests continuing to spread throughout all of Bahrain, or if we see somebody like the Houthis expand their control over most of Yemen, there's just this fear that then Iran will sort of be tempted. They're not going to be able to resist the chance then to actually really begin more overt interference in these countries. And therefore these things there needs to be a stop put to that. Now, when you look at all the security threats that have developed, how the whole situation has deteriorated overall, it's of course compounded a little bit by deep disappointment about American policy in the region. And I think this goes, the real frustration that I feel from Gulf leaders is the fact that they just don't feel they're being listened to correctly. I still remember, in the debate in end of 2002, beginning of 2003, when there was this, is the U.S. going to start and launch its invasion of Iraq? The Gulf leaders were, really trying, especially Saudi Arabia, was really trying to prevent the U.S. from undertaking this invasion, saying, you are opening in Pandora's box if you're going in that direction. And then when it became clear that those messages were not being listened to, that the U.S. was going to go ahead with its invasion, again, the regional leaders tried to implore on Washington, take care of the post-conflict environment. We need to keep structures in place in Iraq. We can't just allow this to deteriorate. And what did the U.S. policy was disbanding the Iraqi security services, and the result was exactly what the Gulf leaders sort of feared. And then this disappointment continued with coming in of the Obama administration, because here you finally had a feeling in 2007. Beginning of 2008, that security situation in Iraq was starting to stabilize. We had the awakening movement. We had, there were some positive signs out there. And then we see the Obama administration coming in and deciding that we need to withdraw from Iraq as quickly as possible. And before giving this process a chance to solidify, to bring some sort of stability back to Iraq, there was simply this notion we need to get our troops out as quickly as possible out of there. And what's the result of that was, once again, we see in Iraq the Maliki government coming into place, withdrawing all support for the Sunni tribes in Iraq, and the situation again deteriorates completely to the point where, last year again we had the highest number of civilian casualties in Iraq that we had since 2007. So, and then if you combine that sort of with the situation in Syria, where there's simply a feeling that the U.S. is not taking this issue serious at all, is trying to avoid it, not even sticking to its own self-imposed red lines, and again, this notion of having to come to an agreement with Iran over the nuclear deal, when absolutely there's no confidence about relations between Iran and the GCC. I think this compounds the problem overall. And what has been the result out of this is the GCC states really feel they've been pushed in a corner. They feel that they really have no other choice. They need to act, and they need to act also on their own. This is not necessarily in their DNA. They tended to always be very cautious, preferring to act at times behind the scenes, and not necessarily having to take the lead role. But now I think there's a feeling that you really have no choice. We cannot rely on necessarily the U.S. To keep order in our kind of way that we would like to see, and therefore there needs to be a move. And I think this is also combined a little bit with, a generational changes taking place in the Gulf. We already have, you see, generational leadership taking place in Qatar, for example. We now have Sheikh Tamim in the UAE. We have leadership with Mohammed bin Zayed. Now, most recently in Saudi Arabia, we have the leadership changes with the elevation of Mohammed bin Nayef as Crown Prince. And I think this combination of a new leadership, a certain degree, sense of confidence about so far, their societies have still grown economically, have prospered in the region. Everything else has been, falling apart. But you feel you still have strong legitimacy. And so there's a sense of confidence also about readiness to act. Why should one hold back? And when push comes to shove, I think the Gulf states have shown that they're ready to act. And we saw this in 1990 when Kuwait was invaded. That immediately there was movement and asking the United States to come in. And I think we see it again, this action on the Yemen issue, where there was a determination made that this is a threat, we need to act, and we will do so. So where does this leave you at the moment in terms of relations with Iran? I think definitely here we can say that relations, of course, are not very good. I think the bottom line, once again, is a feeling that GCC interests are not being taken seriously by people in Tehran. I think there's still a sort of conviction that the Iranian system, the Iranian leadership, continues to see the monarchy system in the region as illegitimate, that they would still see this as being basically just propped up by U.S. support, and therefore there's no trust in terms of Iranian policy as being able to talk to one another at the same level. I think there's a feeling always in the region that somehow the Iranians are talking down on the Gulf leaderships and not seeing them as being equals. One example here is always this dispute about the 3 islands of the UAE, where when this issue kept being brought up, the Iranians always refer to, well, it's simply a misunderstanding between the two sides. And I think the Gulf states feel, no, we're pretty sure of what the dispute is here. You can't tell us that we don't understand this, But I think this all feeds into this mistrust that exists. And of course, I mean, the Gulf states feel like, well, we've already announced that we accept a robust and good nuclear deal. I mean, they came out with relatively positive statements on that. They have continuously, over the years, have always said that Iran has legitimate security interests in the region. And we have numerous statements there. And again, what's the reaction? Well, we see Iraq interfering in Iraq. We see Iran, through Hezbollah, supporting the killing machine of Assad in Syria. And of course, we now see some policy in Yemen as well as trying to provide some support to the Houthis, which overall are not being seen as very positive. So I think at the moment, I don't think the outlook is very good in terms of relations with Iran, because from a GCC perspective, definitely the ball is in Tehran's court to make a move towards the GCC. And if they don't, then I think we're going to see this continued activism by Gulf states, even pursuing sort of interventions here and there, especially also not only in Yemen, but also in Syria. So we are in for quite a contentious period, and I don't see Iran necessarily backing off at the moment from their policy. So this concern about asymmetrical threats from Iran, continued meddling in Arab affairs, is definitely there and will be the guideline for how relations in the future will go. I think you've already given me the notice, so I'll keep my remarks on US GCC for the question and answer period.
Thank you very
pass
much.
it on. Thank you.
Good morning, and I also thank the National Council for hosting this event, and I'm glad to be here with some new colleagues and one in particular old colleague from many years ago. I had, I suppose, 20 meetings in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain in March, and another 20 in Kuwait and Oman just this last week or so. So I think I would like to speak more or less extemporaneously about this and pick up on a few things that John and Christian said. There is deep distrust in these Gulf Arab states about Iran's intentions. And so on the question of inspections and the duration of any nuclear agreement, if the duration is not longer than what has been specified already, and if the inspections are not more extensive, then I think the GCC states will not be happy with an agreement that comes out at the end of June, or even if it's extended. And I would expect them over a period of time to develop some comparable capabilities. I'm pretty sure the Saudis, although it is said that they don't have the technical and scientific capability to develop a nuclear energy program quickly, they have funds and they have friends and they have GCC partners, and I believe they'll move in that direction rather than allow Iran to have some rights that are recognized that they can't match and duplicate. And that will be a thorny issue for U.S. GCC relations. But nevertheless, that's what I expect to see. Of course, there's a long history that John spoke about that feeds this deep distrust in these states. So much of it is ongoing, as Christian mentioned. They see Iran basically surrounding them, particularly now that Iran has been supporting the Houthis in Yemen. And by the way, the Saudis have been saying that Iran has been supporting the Houthis since at least 2009. And we know that they have provided oil, and there have been intercepted arms shipments, and and there are Iranian Revolutionary Guards there. So this is not a figment of the Saudi imagination. And they do seem to think that they are surrounded. It's more than, now when you come to their relationship with the United States, Christian said they're disappointed. I would say they're more than disappointed. I'd say they're suspicious of the United States. You hear from reasonable people that perhaps it's actually the intention of the United States to recognize some enhanced Iranian role in the Arab world. And not only might we acquiesce in this enhanced role, but that we might even think that there's something legitimate or valid in it. So instead of seeing Iran's presence in the Arab world as kind of the unintended consequence of American mistakes, which is the way I see it, they think that maybe there's something deliberate going on here where we want to favor Shia forces and regimes over Sunnis. And so they're evaluating our behavior pretty carefully, and they're not satisfied with it. Certainly, as Christian said, the leaders, such as the king of Saudi Arabia, explicitly and directly and personally and face-to-face asked Bush not to invade Iraq. You know, people say personal relationships between American presidents and these leaders are very important, and they are. But if you give advice to a personal friend who you like, as he did like Bush, much more so than he's deceased now. He liked Bush more than Obama. Even so, if you have a personal friendship and your friend doesn't take your advice, it really that's what really has a consequence for you. Not that you have a personal friendship, that the friend has done something that has a negative consequence for your security. And it certainly did. There are dozens of Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, and they are viewed as a threat to these countries. Kuwait is next door, and it views them as a threat. It's very happy it has 10,000 American troops. Saudi Arabia views it as a threat. It has 30,000 of its own troops on its border. So they're a little bit alarmed about us. And then, of course, there's the fact that we did not intervene in Syria, and that things have become desperate there with 4 million refugees in neighboring countries, 8 million internally displaced people, 3 million more that need food, water, and health care. And we have come very, very, very late to the game. Where now, yes, we are leading some airstrikes there, as we are in Iraq. And finally, the Defense Department is finally getting around to training a moderate opposition force that it really was supposed to start training months ago. But we're late, and we may be too late. So, and I've even heard complaints about the quality of the intelligence and the logistical support that we're providing to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And I've heard that the UAE is actually providing better support than the United States is. So, and then of course, as I said at our conference about a month ago, they're just appalled that we didn't take up the Crown Prince of Abdullah peace plan for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that this has festered for so long and fosters extremism in the region. So I suppose that what we're hearing now about people who are not coming to this Camp David summit over the next few days says something about the way they feel about the United States. I'm not saying the relationships are breaking down. We have extensive intelligence cooperation with these states. We have extensive counterterrorism cooperation with these states. We have extensive trade with these states. They rely upon our military equipment, our training, and pre-positioning of supplies and troops. They're looking for more of that. Evidently, reportedly, Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE asked Obama several weeks ago for written security back. Others would like the same thing. but they're very disappointed in our political judgment, and because of the kinds of mistakes I just outlined, Arab-Israeli mistakes, Iraq, Syria, and suspicious about what might be behind the mistakes. And so, as Christian said, they're taking the lead now and doing things that they evidently don't inform us about. Evidently, the UAE didn't inform us when they did airstrikes in Libya earlier this year. Saudi Arabia didn't inform us until about an hour before they launched airstrikes in Yemen. They're taking matters into their own hands because they're not sure we will. And here's the thing about Camp David, I think, that bears some thought. When they're looking for security assurances from the United States, when they're invited to Camp David to be given security assurances by the United States over what this nuclear deal is going to mean, and they find out that the administration is essentially scrambling to decide what it can and cannot offer in the days before they're supposed to come here, that might has something to do with why they have downgraded their delegations, because they may not be satisfied with what they know they're about to be offered at Camp David. Some of the things, is that my time? Some of the things they might like would be quite difficult. Congress would have to approve a treaty that gave them the same kind of assurances that Japan has or that Turkey has, and I doubt that they would. But what I've heard is that the president is going to make a statement of assurance that won't necessarily be binding on his successor, and that won't have much validity in their eyes because he made statements about Syria that he didn't carry through on. So I think you'll see GCC states, in light of these nuclear agreements and in light of their disappointment and even suspicion of the U.S., I think you'll see them pull closer together and cooperate as they are. There seems to have been some kind of thaw between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, whereby they are willing to coordinate their activities in Syria more closely, and that even is resulting in a little more success for the people they're supporting on the ground, as some of the victories in Idlib, which may be kind of significant because if it lets opposition move toward the Mediterranean coast, toward the Shia stronghold in Latakia, then Damascus will really lose some of its power, and so will Iran. So you see a little more cooperation there between those two countries that had pretty frosty relations until recently. And you have support for the Saudi actions in Yemen, where, for example, the Kuwaiti Air Force is helping, although I'm not sure it's helping over the skies of Yemen, but it is helping with its F-18s. And they're going to, I think, lead because they don't believe they can rely on us. And in some ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do want to say, as final word, I want to say this. At a conference that we did recently, the Middle East Policy Council, we were discussing this, and I said, what more can we do to drain the swamp? In other words, to improve the situation in the region so that there wasn't so much extremism and extremists didn't have such ease recruiting people to their cause. And one of the panelists said, it's not our swamp. And yeah, it's not our neighborhood. They live there. They have some responsibility for the way the region has gone. But we have dropped some bombs in the swamp, and some crocodiles have come out. And we have some responsibility for helping rectify these things. Not that I want to get dragged into another Vietnam, but we do need to consider the long history of our friendship with them and what we owe them given the mistakes we've made to them. And actually, that wasn't my last comment. Here's my last comment. I read a comment by a Washington analyst who summed this thing up by saying, we're coming to the realization that the Gulf Arab states are our friends, but not our allies. And we're coming to the realization that Iran is not our friend, but it is our ally. And I would really like to have a conversation with him, because this is something I don't understand. I don't understand, after 30 years of our issues with Iran, and where we stand in Syria and Yemen and Iraq, how we can think of Iran as an ally and not think of the GCC states as allies. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the National Council of U.S.-Arab Relations for inviting me here today. Well, there were very interesting points mentioned previously by the previous speakers, and most of them mentioned the issue of trust between the different sides, Iran and GCC and U.S. and Iran. I'm here and I've been asked to speak about Iran-GCC energy cooperation, possibilities, of course, and challenges more than opportunities. But we often are asked about the future of the market. Being in the energy industry, everybody wants to forecast the market, see where the fight in the OPEC is going on, where the Iranian production is going on, if there is any deal, and what will be the geopolitical environment in the Middle East and how things are going to solve. Something that, on the issue of trust, something that I personally observe and I think is very important is just not the trust issue between Iran and GCC, which it has historically never been a trust. The issue of Sunni Shias, the inconsistency in the policies and statements of two sides with each other. There have been some efforts from some of the Iranian governments, like during presidency of Mr. Rafsanjani or the current president, Mr. Rouhani, and his administrative, that they have announced that they want to rebuild and to create a better relation with their Arab neighbors. However, between the actions and different statements of different power centers in Iran, even at the same time, there has been inconsistency. So, of course, we can expect from the Arab sides not to trust the other side completely. But something very important happened is the lack of trust and mistrust that is happening and increasing from GCC side to U.S. as a reliable source to securing the neighborhood and their security. And that's very important because for years and decades, U.S. was a source of securing Persian Gulf and the oil supplies from Persian Gulf and the security of the GCC countries. But when the GCC people, the Arab leaders, are losing their trust and they are thinking of U.S. as a less of a reliable source to securing their security, then what will happen is what is happening currently is that they are deciding that, okay, now is the time for us to taking care of our own security, or to counting on other allies or finding another allies or other sources that could secure or help us securing ourselves. This is something that is new and it could unstable the situation, at least the oil situation, the geopolitics of the region. This is very important and this is what is happening. And in my discussions with many of the leaders, many of the people on the GCC side, something that is important is the psychology of the Arab leaders. And just historically, and the type of life that, the tribal life that Arabs had historically, the issue of trust is very different from the trust, the national interest, reliability is totally different from what we are preserving and what we are perceiving in the United States. In the United States, you can trust Iranian, or you can deal with Iranian not having completely trusting them, but putting some certain reward punishment system or inspecting in order to contain their behavior and to make sure that you are on the same track. But for Arab leaders, that's not the case. So for Arab leaders, psychologically, a friend is a friend forever. It's not a friend that one day could change its friendship or alliance because its national interest is changed, or the national interest is now preserving by having another ally, or changing its alliance to friendship or friendship to alliance. So this is very important to understand that, like, how an Arab leader psychologically would think and what would be a reliable source and trustable source for Arab leaders. Back to the issue of energy. Iran and GCC had been always a turbulent political relations historically, but they always kept a minimum trade relation. Even between Iran and Saudi Arabia, there has been always a minimum of trade relation. UAE, it has been mentioned, has always had territorial problems with Iran in the last more than 3 decades, but they UAE is Iran's largest trade partner among GCC members. And the trade amount between the trade relation between Iran and GCC increased particularly between 2000 to 2008. The imports from GCC from Iran increased from around $1 billion per year to $13 billion, and the exports increased from $6 million to roughly $2 billion. However, of course, the sanctions of 2012-2013 have reduced this trade relation and economic transaction between members furthermore, even to a certain extent by 1/3. On energy, there are lots of opportunities that Iran and GCC could look at. And of course, when we could think if there is an issue of money, and whatever add money and secure your economy and secure your demand could be a possible way of looking into a relationship. And Iran's and its Arab neighbors, to begin with, they are sharing more than tens of share oil fields and gas. Iran with Qatar, with Iraq, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, they all have share oil and gas fields, which they could start. Iran has already some agreements with Qatar. They're just, they never been more than an agreement. They never really jointly worked on these fields, but they could possibly start looking at this opportunity. The second one is investment. Of course, Iran is looking for its current 5-year plan to attract $155 billion of investment, which most of it never happened because of sanctions. They need $50 billion of investment in their upstream. And, of course, some of the investment could come potentially from some of its Arab and neighbor or GCC countries. The other part that, of course, makes sense and is an immediate need with the gas export. Gas export from Iran to countries like UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia particularly would be an importance. UAE has a bad experience with Iran. Of course, when we are in UAE, there are slight differences between how Dubai is looking into Iran, how Abu Dhabi is looking at Iran, but still the option of gas export to UAE could be a good option. Kuwait, of course, and exporting Iranian gas to Oman and then exporting it from there. Omani's LNG facility could be the other option. To Saudi Arabia would be really good, make an economic sense, of course, because Saudi Arabia, its consumption is increasing a lot, particularly in its electricity section and industry. Saudi Arabia has a huge petrochemical industry, and it's #1 in the region, using liquid fuel as a feedstock for its petrochemical factory. If we look at U.S. shale oil and shale gas, which are promoting, Saudi Arabia price-wise could compete with U.S. petrochemical production in the market if it could have a natural gas as a feedstock instead of the fuel, liquid fuel. Iranian gas could be the best option, could be the price-wise the cheapest way of having access to natural gas. Saudi Arabia doesn't have access to enough of water with the current technology to develop its shale gas resources. So in exporting gas from Iran to Saudi Arabia could help this country's petrochemical industry and could help the kingdom to compete price-wise with U.S. petrochemical products in the same market. The other industry would be the electricity. Of course, they could, instead of using fuel and liquid fuel in their electricity, power generation, they could use Iranian natural gas. The other area of cooperation would be, of course, OPEC. Iran is not Iranian crude oil that is going to expand hugely. There are some experts that are going to that extent and predicting that it's going to be an Iran-Saudi alliance in OPEC against Iraqi crude oil production, because that's Iraqi crude oil production that we're expecting to ramp up hugely. However, I personally don't think that's going to happen, because Iran never had a policy of cutting Iraqi income. And Iraq at the current moment is 90% dependent on its oil income, and of course both and Saudis are not going to do anything that Iraqi income would be more reliant upon international sources. So these are the opportunities, of course, but what are the challenges? I would divide the challenges into technical challenges and political challenges. On the technical challenges is, if the gas export of Iran is a good option, where is the export capacity? At the current moment, Iran doesn't have any natural gas export capacity. Iran has the second hugest natural gas reserves in the world, but the share of its market in the global market is less than 1%. And the reason for that is the high consumption, domestic consumption, and also sanctions. They never really, most of Iranian natural gas fields are untapped. But if the sanctions, which were the barrier, are removed due to any possible upcoming negotiations, Iran could, of course, increase its natural gas production, and is expected, regardless of the sanctions, if the sanctions even don't remove Iran's natural gas production from the fields that have been already invested, is going to increase to 1 billion cubic meter, and its condensate is going to increase to 1 million barrels per day in the next 3 years. So Iran is going to have a certain amount of its export capacity is going to increase. However, Iran's export policy of natural gas is very unclear. There have been many different debates if they should use it inside, exporting it as electricity or as natural gas. So there are many technical and energy policy issues. And on the political side, of course, Saudi Arabia buying gas from Iran is like 20 years of marriage. You cannot think of marrying with someone without having at least a basic chemistry. So unless there is any minimum trust between the two countries, the natural gas export from Iran to Saudi or Kuwait or UAE is not going to happen, because it's a longer commitment, long-term commitment, and if you want to rely on a source for your supply and your economy, you need to be sure that's a reliable resource. So that's something that Iran and GCC and its partner that is looking for as a possible market. They should work on it and finish it. I'm going to stop here. I know that my time is finished, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking John Duke Anthony and Mancino and the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations for putting this event together. It's a pretty bleak picture that has been painted today in terms of the lack of trust between Iran and its Arab neighbors in the Persian-Arabian Gulf region. And the question one has to ask oneself is, so where is this all going? There was a report out by the Atlantic Council by Matthew Burrows called Middle East 2020. And it really portrays a very harrowing picture of where this region is going to be in 5 years' time, in the year 2020, if current trends and current patterns continue. We have a region right now with millions and millions of people driven from their homes, something around 50,000 professional terrorists roaming that region, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, supported by various countries, some of them supported by Arabs, some of them supported by Iranians, some calling them terrorists, some calling them freedom fighters. but large sections of that region are for the first time in living memory ungovernable. And the question is, if current patterns continue for the next 5 years, in the year 2020, will it be possible for any of these countries, including the United States, to exert a measure of control over that region? What if instead of 50,000 professional terrorists, you have 100,000 professional terrorists? What if you have, among these people, European passport holders, as we see now, but if we have more of them? What happens then? I remember a few years ago, President Obama was asked about the misery and the devastation that the people in that region have to deal with right now, and he said, well, I look at the world and I see in the Congo, millions of people have been killed in that country's civil war, various civil wars since the late 90s. I think 5 million people is the figure. And when you look at the devastation of, say, Iraq and Syria and that region, maybe it's not as bad, but the problem is that when you have people who are willing to die in the name of God, in the name of religion, these kinds of problems aren't self-contained, in the way that a lot of the problems, horrifying as they are, in Africa are self-contained. And that's the difference between West Asia, Middle East, and much of the rest of the world, is that people are dying and killing in that region in the name of God, whether it is sectarian violence, whether it's Muslim versus non-Muslim. And so the question for all the members of this triangle, the US, the GCC, and Iran, is what can be done about this? None of these parties can be wished away. And the question then becomes, how can we address the legitimate security concerns of both the Arab and the Persian side of this Gulf, pun intended? And to look at that, one has to go back to the year 2003 and to look at the kind of security perception that Iran has, especially has had since 2003. One has to realize that right around the time the invasion of Iraq was beginning in the late March of 2003, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran sent a 3-page fax to the State Department. This is the last week of March of 2003. And in this 3-page fax, which is reproduced in the book that Barbara Slavin wrote, in this 3-page fax, Iran offered to negotiate with the United States on all issues that were driving them apart, including Iran's support for militant organizations, including Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, including Iran's lack of a relationship with and lack of recognition of Israel, weapons of mass destruction. You look at that fax and you see, boy, during Khatami, not only were Iran-GCC relations improving tremendously, you also had a scenario where, with remarks having made by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the year 2000, acknowledging some of the difficult history between the two countries, you thought things were headed in the right direction. And Khatami, of course, had a lot of international legitimacy among Arabs and among Americans. That fax was never replied to. And so in Iran, the perception became, well, after Iraq, we're next. That if we are making this kind of an offer and we're not even getting a reply to this fax, this means that after they're done with Iraq, changing the regime there, we're going to be next. So how can we deal with this? And that's how Iranian foreign policy became militarized more than ever before, even more than the time of the Iran-Iraq war, because during that time there was no perception that the Americans were coming. Relations with the U.S. weren't good, but there was no fear during the 80s, even during the peak of the Iran-Iraq war, that the Americans are going to be invading. That became the dominant, although unmentioned, undeclared perception in Iran that unless we fight them outside of Iran, we're going to have to fight them inside of Iran. And that began really the process of the militarization of Iranian foreign policy in the form of backing militias across the region, especially in Iraq. And that's how the Revolutionary Guard really stepped up its activities in Iraq to be able to bog down the Americans there instead of inside Iran to basically make sure that the Americans understand that wars aren't things that you can win easily in that part of the world. That's how the process of militarization began. That's what led to the presidency of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who really came to office, to use a Godfather analogy, as a wartime conciliary, the system expecting that there was going to be a war. But that war with the U.S. thankfully never came. But that mentality could no longer be pulled out of the national psyche and the Iranian government psyche. And so you had, throughout the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, greater and greater militarization of Iranian foreign policy. And you see, for example, and you had the Quds Force, the kind of foreign operations branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, becoming more active, not only in Iraq, but across that region. And the war never came. The war with America never came, but then Iran was constantly preparing for that war during those 8 years. You know, the oil revenues were flowing in to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. There was this sense of the buoyancy of the spirits that came with that, with those resources. The war never came, but then the sanctions came. And so you have now, for example, a situation where last December, with the coordination of a lot of Iranian institutions, you had the Arba'in pilgrimage in Iraq hosting 15 million people. This is last December. This was the largest gathering of people in human history. Never in history had so many millions of people gathered in one place. And the security for this was provided, not all of it, but much of it, again, by the Iranian military. And this is a celebration that's happening in Najaf and Karbala. They call it Bain al-Haramain, between these two holy cities in Shia Islam. And if I were sitting in any of these Arab countries, looking at 15 million people, you know, chanting Ya Hussein, I would find that very troubling. And it is a troubling development, because who is behind this? Who is organizing these millions of people to make these kinds of pilgrimages? And so we are where we are right now. The region is in a very, very bad shape. And I believe the only thing that threatens everyone, people in that region and the international community, more than the devastation itself, the only thing that threatens us more than the devastation itself is a sense of learned helplessness, that we can't do anything about it. That we just have to let these wars burn themselves out, you know, until enough people are killed, so that there's just no more willingness or ability to fight. And that's when we don't have that luxury. And especially the United States, this notion that the U.S. just can't do anything, that America's leadership is a thing of the past. These are the real issues that threaten international stability, and they have to be addressed today among all of these countries. There are certain things that all of us have in common, whether we're Americans, Iranians, Arabs, what have you. And the most significant of these is bringing a measure of governability back to this region. And in that light, if I were looking at it from the vantage point of GCC countries, I would welcome an opening between America and Iran, because Iran's threat perception has, for the past 37 years, revolved around enmity towards the United States. Because, you know, Iran hasn't thought that, for example, Qatar or the UAE is going to be invading Iran, but it has thought, especially during the time of the Iraq War, that it was going to be invaded by the U.S. And the best way of getting it to pull back from its pan-Shia, Shia chauvinist ideology is to address its security concerns vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. It's not going to be an alliance, but it can have the semblance of a normal relationship with dialogue, with an official American presence in Iran. If I were a GCC member, I would welcome that, because Iran would have much less of a reason, in a scenario like that, to be aggressive, to foment Shia militancy across that region, because it's used that not so much as a matter of ideology, but it's used it as a matter of strategic depth. If you come after me here, I'm going to go after you elsewhere. That's been the logic, and in that light, I'm hoping that our Arab friends and brothers will come to the agreement with much of the rest of the international community that an opening between the U.S. and Iran is to the advantage of GCC countries, because that's how Iran can see a region that isn't opposed to it but can work more closely with it. Thank you very much.
Good morning. This is what happens when you come at the end of a very distinguished panel of specialists. You try to pick up the pieces, whatever they didn't talk about. So I'll try my best. Well, my charge today is, well, first, thanks for the council. Thank you all for coming today. My charge today is to talk about how U.S., Iran, GCC, Iran relations, how do these things work out as far as Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq are concerned. I will talk a little bit about that, but I want to go back. I just decided as I was sitting there that maybe there were some aspects of specific Iranian domestic policies and behavior and political system that really influence what actually the whole theme of this meeting is about. First, the issue of U.S. and GCC, how do they look at, for instance, Syria? We all heard what the speakers have already mentioned that, but the idea is that there's a lot of disappointment on the GCC side as to what the United States was able or unable to deliver regarding Syria, considering that Syria has really become a quagmire. It's become a stalemate. So far, it has become a stalemate. Maybe who knows that the new opposition victories in the north and south may really be creating a new environment, so to speak, a new battlefield reality, so to speak, that would probably hasten some sort of a solution. Hopefully that comes tomorrow before the day after. Obviously, the Obama administration is not necessarily really interested in how the Assad regime. It's interested in how the Assad regime falls, but it's not working to, at least to our knowledge, to collapse that regime. At the same time, it's trying to assist in the formation of Syrian opposition forces that would fight the other enemy, the ISIS people. This is something that the GCC and the United States do not necessarily see eye to eye on, although both of them really work together on fighting ISIS within the international coalition to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria. As far as Lebanon is concerned, obviously both are concerned about what's happening there. There is institutional stalemate. Both of them believe that Lebanon should really get on with its institutional rebuilding, election of a president, new parliamentary elections that would really bring in a legitimate parliament to the country. Obviously, both are concerned about Hezbollah interference in Syria, and the Syrian crisis has both from a humanitarian angle and from a military angle has actually become a Syrian problem, a Lebanese problem as well. Hezbollah's interference in Syria obviously invites, not that they need an invitation anyway, invites ISIS and the Nusra Front into Lebanese domestic affairs, and they are trying to influence Lebanese domestic affairs, but at the same time, it invites Hezbollah into basically deciding the future of Lebanese foreign policy or the future of the country regarding whether this country really should be involved in the Syrian crisis or not. So this is something that both the U.S. and the GCC are trying to ameliorate, trying to work on. I really don't think that there will be anything coming out of that, considering that Hezbollah does its own thing. And this is where Iranian foreign policy comes in. If Iran wants to really make things happen in Lebanon, maybe it should talk to Hezbollah about allowing certain things to happen. As far as Iraq is concerned, obviously the history is rather long. The United States and the GCC for a while thought that maybe we can cooperate on certain things in Iraq, but apparently domestic politics within Iraq and the presence of an overwhelming influence of Iranian-supported Shiite parties and militias is really making cooperation on Iraq rather difficult. I think the only cooperation going on now probably is against ISIS, but there is another little bit of cooperation regarding what to do with helping the Iraqi state, so to speak, stand up on its feet. The signal that was sent by the American Congress that any assistance to the Iraqi government, military assistance, would have to really take into account assistance to the Kurds and the Sunni tribes at the same time. So basically the United States and its different institutions are probably looking at the Iraqi situation in a rather divisive kind of way, which is making the Iraqi political system still yet unstable. It will make it yet more unstable. And this is something that really Iran may be able to influence, because after Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was basically deposed, he was not allowed to take a third term. It looked for a while that Prime Minister Abadi is probably able to get everybody together, put everybody in the service of the Iraqi state. It looks like he's finding it rather difficult to really accomplish, and the presence of many Iranian-supported political parties and militias in Iraq is not making that necessarily really very easy for him. On to basically, the theme of today is what happens after a nuclear deal. If a nuclear deal happens, what is the future of these relations between all the parties concerned? To me, obviously it is in each and every capital involved in all of this, but at the same time, it is very much in Tehran. As far as I'm concerned, the issue of whether the United States becomes Iran's ally or friend, really, I don't think it depends on Washington more than it depends on how Iranians themselves within Tehran's institutions, are thinking about the United States or the world at large. The Iranian political system is riven with factionalism. There are a lot of factions that each of them have in their own way its own influence on Iran's foreign policy. An Iranian political scientist called it suspended equilibrium. There is equilibrium between different factions, and at the same time, you really don't know who really calls the shots. Is it really the secular presidency, or is it the religious authorities? And that itself is essential to how Iran formulates its foreign policy and how it may or may not be open to allowing for a, first of all, thawing of relations, and second of all, augmenting warmer relations with the United States or with the GCC countries. The issue of Iran has to decide. It really has to decide. But first, I have to say something. The GCC states are prototypical status quo states. These are states that are not looking for revolution. They're not looking for instability. They're not looking for any kind of geostrategic change as far as they are concerned and as far as others are concerned. These are very status quo states. Iran has not decided whether it wants to be a status quo state or a revolutionary state. And this is necessarily very, very much at the heart of what happens with Iranian foreign policy and its relations with the GCC and the United States. So if the Iranian factions have to decide whether they really want to keep pushing for revolution and they really or they want to deal with the political systems that are around them and the international community as it is, as a status quo situation, a status quo strategic situation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you panelists for interesting discussions and great views and opinions, some from the region directly, some having the energy sector and various other things. But what we'll do now is go over until 11 o'clock with questions and answers and open it up to the panel's discussion. Based on the questions I've got, the first one is Dr. Sarah. What is the impact of the Iranian nuclear agreement on the production of energy, minerals, and batteries?
Well, of course, a nuclear deal is going to have immediate impact on Iran's production. Iran's crude oil production has been dropped since 2012, sanctions on its oil export. They're going to increase their production. They are planning to increase their production to the pre-2012. On other regions, of course, it's very much dependent. I mean, if you look at Iraq, it depends on its domestic turmoil more than in Iran. But I believe that if Iran can produce its oil comfortably and attract investment, the hydrocarbon law in Iraq might finally pass. On petrochemical, not necessarily minerals, it's going to affect if there is going to be any export of natural gas to Saudi or UAE or Kuwait. These countries could have more export capacity because the demand in non-OECD, particularly between the GCC producers and in Iran, is increasing massively due to the population rate, lack of efficiency, and also waste. So they are going to need most of the energy that they are exporting to use in their own countries. And having that natural gas is going to be a big help for maintaining their crude oil export capacity.
Next question is, if the Iraq war was a mistake, one was responsible for Iran's rise as a regional power, why would any option other than diplomacy, such as military action, which would occur if Iran decides to build a bomb, work? Something must be done about Iran. What are the alternatives? We don't need trust. Saudi Arabia has been funding terrorism in the region, and we have no trouble flushing them or trusting them without verification. So you want to address that first, and then we'll just give the panel, open it up for the panel to...
I'd like to ask some questions.
Okay. All right. If the Iraq war was a mistake, one that was responsible for Iran's rise in regional power, why would any option other than diplomacy, such as military action, which would occur if Iran decides to build a bomb, work? Something must be done about Iran. What are the alternatives? We don't need trust. Saudi Arabia has been funding terrorism in the region. We have no trouble trusting them without verification. Well, it's a little bit of both. I think if we could just make one or two comments on it. I think you were addressing the issue of the rise of Iranian militants.
Yes.
And then,
the best thing that could happen for regional stability is for there to be an American official presence in Iran. That has been a geopolitical void for close to 4 decades now. It is a country of 80 million people with a little bit of history, as you know, and it's not going anywhere. And even during the time of the Shah, who was one of the United States' leading allies in the world at the time, it had an independent streak. And it has even more of that today. So how do you address this country's security concerns? Once you do that, and I believe an American presence in Tehran is going to contribute substantially to that, because Iran's threat perception has been basically focused on the U.S., as I mentioned before. Some kind of normalization, not an alliance, but some kind of normalization where you feel that you're not going to be invaded is going to basically bring about more moderate Iranian behavior, I think naturally. And especially if we could get Arab countries to invest in Iran, become a part of, have a presence, expand your presence. Instead of retreating, I'd say expand your presence.
I'm not sure I got the validity of the implications of, if I inferred correctly, that USA's relations with Saudi Arabia went in an absence of trust, more or less. Saudi Arabia funds terrorism. If the implication was, well, Iran funds extremist militants, terrorists, whatever, why can't the U.S. have relations with Iran? If that was all the thrust, I don't find that viable. People want to be able to trust those with whom they enter into relations that bear on security, that bear on stability, that bear on the prospects and the potential for prosperity. And so here we have Iran's undeniable involvement in at least 4 countries, with Iranian leaders saying, in essence, we control the capitals of 4 Arab countries. I mean, this is extremist rhetoric and political recklessness run amok or writ large. So there's no reciprocity here. There's no evidence, to my knowledge, of any GCC country interfering in the domestic affairs of Iran. So this gross asymmetry of who's interfering and disturbing the other is, I think, the more appropriate focus, and not the question of have relations with somebody, whether you have trust with them or not. This interference has to desist, stop, before there are any prospects for the relevant levels of trust and confidence.
Well, is this on? Okay. So part of the question was, is there any alternative other than diplomacy? Oh, I certainly favor diplomacy. I think war would be, would have terrible consequences for everybody in the region. So yes, I'm in favor of diplomacy with Iran. Unfortunately, to refer to another Middle East Policy Council conference, the former director of CIA said we cannot rely on American intelligence to determine whether or not Iran is cheating on an agreement like this. So there would have to be, he just said we don't have the capability to know everything that's happening in the country. So there would have to be a tremendous amount of cooperation to make sure that the agreement was being upheld. And you would have to move beyond that into negotiating about other issues in the region. And I think, once again, you would have to have Iranian concessions there because, yeah, they are all over the Arab world. And not only did someone say we control 4 Arab capitals, but Qasem Soleimani said a couple of months ago we have successfully exported the revolution to the Arab world, including to Bahrain. And he specifically mentioned Bahrain. So, and actually that leads into another issue. I want diplomatic relations, but I don't know about a presence in Tehran right now. I think the factions have to decide who's running things. In 1979, there was only one faction that took the American diplomats hostage. but they used it to prevail over the other factions. So let's get that straight first. And then on the other issue, you say Saudi Arabia is funding terrorism. Who do you mean? The Saudi Arabian government? Is that the allegation? The Saudi Arabian government's funding terrorism? You know, it's awfully hard to control every financial transaction taking place within a country, but they're making an effort to control the flow of money from private citizens to charities that might funnel the money out beyond where it can be easily tracked. They're fighting terrorists. I mean, they are giving us better cooperation on our counterterrorism efforts against Al Qaeda than anybody else. So they understand that this is a threat to them. They wouldn't be funding them. So I'll leave it at that.
Anybody else? Have a comment on that? Please.
The issue of whether the United States wants to be present in Tehran or not. I mean, obviously it's up to the United States to decide whether it wants to do that or not. But no matter how much presence, the United States is in Beijing, and Beijing is building islands in the South Pacific so it can control the sea length. I mean, why can't the United States stop Beijing from doing that? Because it can. This is a Beijing decision. It's the Chinese leadership that's doing this. It's important that the Iranian leadership know what is good, what's not good. We can't just simply blame the United States or blame the GCC only, or blame certain sectors in the Iranian political system. I mean, everybody says the president is really a moderate guy. Yeah, that's fine. Let the president be moderate. Other factors will not let him.
Okay, thanks. One specific question about maybe with regard to the UAE islands issue, whether or not this becomes part of the Iran agreement, whether that becomes the P5+1 settles that as a sidebar issue, or you're the authority on this.
Whether it becomes part of the nuclear agreement?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, the United States wants to resolve this issue, this nuclear issue. And although it has conversations on the side about Yemen, for example, I don't think it's going to tie the islands issue to a nuclear agreement, and neither would Iran. The issues that are the gravest threat to life and limb in the Middle East are the chaos in Iraq, chaos in Syria, and I think those issues will be higher on the agenda than the islands. And the other thing about it is that I did a book on it, and the UAE has a great deal of documentary physical evidence of the possession and use of the islands for centuries. And Iran can't present anything even remotely comparable to that. So from a historical and legal point of view, the islands belong to the UAE. Iran's not going to give them up. It won't go to the International Court of Justice. Absolutely won't, because it knows it will lose, because it can't present evidence. And I've never seen any evidence that they're willing to negotiate in good faith with the UAE on a bilateral basis. So that issue is not going to be resolved quickly, and certainly won't be tied to the nuclear issue.
Anybody have any? I'm just going to open this up to the panelists, and maybe we can just go down the line and ask your response to the question, which is fairly timely for today. The Obama administration is obviously embarrassed by King Salman's decision not to come to the GCC summit. Was this intentionally a snub, or was it something else? And if so, why? So, John?
I've read that in the media. I don't take it that way at all. I I think that would be a view of people who've not lived and worked in the region. Saudi Arabia is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and its head of state is naturally deferred to by most other Arab heads of state, one could say in the realm of protocol, appropriately. And one does not necessarily read into that a power play or snub as such. It so happens that Qatar is the current head of the GCC. It's the head of the Supreme Council, its decision-making body, and the Ministerial Council, the policy recommendation body. Qatar should be, and appropriately will be, front and center of a GCC contextual face to this summit. Not a Saudi Arabia, not a Kuwaiti, not a Bahraini, not an Emirati, not an Omani. So I think King Salman's holding back was appropriate. That's point one. Point two is that Mohammed bin Nayef clearly has been on a day-to-day basis the individual working more the defense, security, and intelligence issues than King Salman. So these two aspects, I think, provide a bit more credible perspective for the absence of the king, and seconded as being appropriate.
No, I completely agree with John Duke. I don't think this was a snub in any case. I think the appropriate and the important people are going to be here. I think there's also an element here that, from the Saudi perspective, they don't want this simply to be turned into a Saudi-U.S. issue. I think they definitely want this as being a GCC-U.S. summit. Saudi Arabia has been pushing very hard for greater coordination among the GCC states. They have made tremendous effort to try to bridge differences with Qatar, between Qatar and UAE, try to put forward common positions. We do remember King Abdullah's statement of trying to move the GCC from corporation to union. So I think it is very important, the message to be sent, that this is not going to be just a Saudi opinion or a Saudi wish list here coming to Washington, but that this is a common position, that the GCC states are pulling on this as one group, and that the U.S. would have to deal with the GCC as a whole. And I think this is the emphasis that they also wanted to provide.
Well, I just heard my two colleagues, and those are valid arguments. What I said in my speech was that there may be a message here that what the assurances they think they're going to get are not sufficient. But I may be wrong about that. The King of Saudi Arabia, I'm exhausted, and I'm not 79. I just came back from the Middle East. And I haven't had surgery. I'm not on medication, and I'm not 79, but I'm exhausted. So if he feels that this was not a trip he absolutely needed to make, and that we could deal with somebody we know and trust, like Mohammed bin Nayef, and that we can get to know somebody we need to get to know, like Mohammed bin Salman, then maybe that's a better explanation than what I was saying about showing some disappointment with assurances.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with Tom on just who the king picked to send. It's very important in that sense. The message is who's really going to be effective in the talks rather than this conflict to be here and also to be.
I concur. I'm sure that whatever goes on in the meeting will be broadcast simultaneously in Riyadh, and the king will be listening to everything, I'm sure. At the same time, it's interesting that the same kind of things that are coming out today about the snub and all this stuff, basically trying to create the image that there is really a rift between the United States and Saudi Arabia, specifically Saudi Arabia. There are disagreements, obviously, there are differences in opinions, obviously. But at the same time, the same kind of atmosphere that was said, that is being said about the snub, was a couple of weeks ago, or a month ago, when Mohammed bin Nayef became Crown Prince. Everyone said, "Oh, America's man is Crown Prince." Well, if America's man is Crown Prince, why can't he come here to attend the meeting? He is the important man, obviously.
Thank you. On the other side, there's a question, do you believe President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif want to bring Iran into the mainstream or simply lift sanctions? Did you want to start?
I would say they're
That to everybody.
inseparable from one another. There are two main discourses to Iranian foreign policy. One is the revolutionary pan-Shia one. The other one is more of the run-of-the-mill Persian patriotism, if you like, which is more secular. And the Islamic Republic has been driven by both ideologies. The question is to what extent. Any kind of normalization, especially vis-a-vis the U.S., is going to strengthen more moderate behavior because Shia ideology is all about, as you know, the stories of Imam Hussein's martyrdom is all about fighting oppression, fighting injustice. And I'd say that for Rouhani and Zarif, having the sanctions lifted and any kind of opening to the U.S. would be viewed as very popular among people in general. And that's the irony of it all. We have a revolutionary government there whose population, as we found out through polling that was done in the late 90s, early 2000s, is predominantly, overwhelmingly pro-American in the sense that if you ask people in Iran, and poll after poll has shown this, would you like this country's relations with the U.S. to be normalized? Overwhelmingly, people say yes. And the irony of it is that some of the other countries in that region, if you go to the people in the street, say in Turkey or Egypt, and you ask, you don't get those same kinds of numbers. And so the question is, what's going on here? And so any opening would be, initiated by any politician would be very popular on the street, I think.
Well, I mean, I think from the GCC side, of course, there's still a lot of questions about decision-making structures in Iran. I mean, we hear positive things coming from Foreign Minister Zarif. I think recently he wrote a little piece in the New York Times calling for collective security in the region. We've seen President Rouhani also state that, saying that the relations with Saudi Arabia are of utmost importance and they're critical. But we don't really know if these people have the necessary power inside the Iranian political system to make those views become more substantive. You have the feeling that whatever they move forward on, and in the statements that the rug could be pulled from under them if the supreme leader decides to say something different, and then we don't know exactly where does one stand on this whole issue. And I think this is a concern a little bit. Of course, on the other hand, I think we've seen a number of statements recently from all different Iranian leadership that again underline this sense that how sincere is Iran in trying to really move forward with relations with the region. I mean, you have even President Rouhani saying, accusing Saudi leadership of, I think it was mental imbalances, in terms of their actions in Yemen. You have statements from the Republican Guard saying that the Al Saud families are teetering on the brink of collapse. You even have, I think, Ayatollah Khomeini, when he commented on the leadership changes in Saudi Arabia, saying, well, now we're dealing with a bunch of inexperienced youngsters. I mean, these are all statements that, they're to a certain degree, they're quite offensive. I mean, we don't see the GCC leadership commenting on that in that way about Iranian leaders. So again, the doubts are there about what the intentions are at the end of the day.
I go a little further than Christian and say that I don't believe that Rouhani and Zarif have the file on Iraq or Syria or Yemen. I think they're pretty strictly limited to the nuclear file. So what they think about those things is not really what matters.
I mean, I can actually confirm that. This was pointed out to us. We at GRC, we've been holding sort of track 2 dialogues with the Iranians now for almost 3 years, intermittently. And this is an issue that has come up, and it was confirmed in those meetings that we cannot talk about Syria or Iraq. It's simply not in our profile.
What Christian said rightly. There is also a supervisory body to the negotiations, including specifically conservative members of parliament of the Iraqi Shura Council, Iranian Shura Council, who basically forced the Ayatollah to appoint them to the supervisory committee to oversee the negotiations. So even in that, they don't have full freedom.
In this momentary lull, I wanted to recognize that we had 2 ambassadors here, one from the League of Arab States, Ambassador Mohammed Sharif al-Husseini, and we had the ambassador of the GCC to the United Nations. There is no GCC office in the United States, unlike in Brussels, where there's been one for some time. And the ambassador to the United Nations served there, as well as in his current post in New York. Welcome to you both.
Please.
I wanted to add a point, just to complement the other speakers. The nuclear negotiations and where it has been directed so far will desecuritize the image of Iran, and this could help with the erosion of the sanctions. So even if the sanctions are not removed on Iran completely, but some of them are going to erode. And that, of course, will help with investment and Iran's economy. On the GCC side, I very much agree that about the different power centers in Iran and the statements that are not coherent with each other. I mean, on one hand, we have Mr. Zarif saying that relation with GCC is like a dance that the other partner or Saudi is not willing to dance. But just less than a week, there are statements that calling Al Saud or what they're going to collapse. So I think this inconsistency between the policies and statements that are observed and coming out of Iran, of course, increase the issue of trust. It doesn't help, of course. But on the side of, okay, Iran and its GCC neighbors are neighbors forever. They're living close to each other, and maybe that's like, I mean, having a good relation is different than just we have to live with each other. And that's not going to happen unless there is a unified signal from Iranian side that there is a will for having better relation with GCC.
The question was just forwarded up. Was the Iranian regime fear of its people or from the U.S. Israel, which one's greater? My apologies also if I didn't read your questions or we're not taking that. So a lot of them I'm having difficulty reading. So don't feel as if we're ignoring you. It's just because I can't interpret what's written with clarity and being able to read it and deliver at the same time. But this one was right on the money, and so that's why I got. So the Iranian regime's fear is Iran's regime fearful of its people or from the U.S. U.S.-Israeli relationship, and which one is greater?
I'll take a stab at that really
Please.
easy question. Economic conditions have been bad in Iran, so out of a population of 80 million, you have about 40 million people who are barely subsisting. And that's a recipe for instability and rebellion. When you're hungry, when you see your kids hungry, malnourished, with little prospects for growth and, economic progress. And the best way of changing that scenario is to introduce at least a modicum of economic opportunity, which would presumably come. So some folks are saying, will this embolden Iran with the lifting of sanctions? Will the unfreezing of the 100 billion and more dollars that the country has had in reserves abroad that have been impounded? The question is, will that make Iran more aggressive? I think not, because it will give it a taste of prosperity, a modicum of it, and I think it will stabilize the situation. And ultimately, there has to be a discourse in Iran moving forward that gradually, not immediately, but gradually lessens the appeal of the death chants. I mean, this is the only country I know of where people chant death to this, death to this country, death to that country. That's just not really becoming on an ancient civilization. That has to end at some point. You cannot have normal relations with the world and then every Friday say death to this country, death to another. That's just not going to work. And if people by themselves chant that, they need to be instructed not to just like they're instructed to chant it. I think they need to be instructed not to chant that, because you can't, one day have good relations, say, we have a dialogue, at the same time we wish death upon you. That's just not done. It's just not becoming, especially on a country that has such a rich civilization. And so the discourse that will emerge, I think, will have a lot to do with the kind of country Iran becomes. And the more integrated it is in its region, the less reason it would have to foment instability beyond its borders.
Anybody else like to comment on that question, or just move on to that?
Yeah, may I?
Yeah, please.
Like what Rashid said, in addition to that, there is a lot of speculation, and some of it is actually quite accurate, that maybe the Iranian system, as it is now, does not want to open up to the world, because opening up to the world is opening up to globalization, and whatever globalization forces you would import into your society may really be the security challenge that you will never be able to deal with. And maybe the Iranian authorities do not want that to happen, specifically not only the religious establishment, but also the military establishment, and specifically the IRGC, the Republican Guard. I mean, these people have a monopoly on certain sectors of the economy, telecommunications, transportation, things of that nature. I mean, they employ at least like 200,000, 300,000 people in different economic enterprises. So if you open up the Iranian system, whether political or economic, it's likely that they will have a competition that they really do not want.
I don't know the answer to that question about where they fear most, but I know what they did in 2009 when there were demonstrations protesting the result of the presidential election, and I assume they'd be willing to do it again if it was necessary to hold on to power.
Well, as a follow-up question for you, with regard to Syria, there was a question from the audience. You said that the U.S. may be too late intervening in Syria. What would you see happening in Syria that could have been prevented by earlier U.S. intervention, and what should that intervention consist of?
Again, I don't know if it's too late or it's not too late. I see we're stepping up activity, and I see our partners making some progress in the ground, and I see the regime suffering some setbacks and potential setbacks, but I don't know how it will come out. As to what we could have done, sure, there are things we could have done 3 or 4 years ago that might have improved the situation there today. And I point out that neither the United States nor the GCC countries turned against Assad very quickly. They gave him 8 or 9 or 10 months to try to encourage him to deal in a moderate way with the opposition, and it wasn't until late in 2011 that even Saudis and others said, enough killing, you got to go. But at that point, the United States could have done certain things. It could have provided the kinds of weapons that would have enabled the moderate opposition to do better on the battlefield. It could have even tried to set up a safe zone in which a moderate opposition could have operated and tried to set up some kind of alternate government, and that would have required a no-fly zone. Okay, those are things could have done, and they were, and people went to Kerry and Obama and advocated those things. When the chemical weapons were used, it wasn't necessarily, let's send 500,000 troops in there to pay him back for that. It could have been something like dropping ordnance to crater military airfields so he couldn't get his planes up in the air and drop barrel bombs on people standing in bread lines. There are a lot of things that we could have done along the way that might have made the situation better. And that certainly, although I sincerely admire our president for many, many, many things, I think he made some mistakes, and it was he who decided that we wouldn't engage in Syria in a more robust way, because Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Director of Central Intelligence came to him with very detailed military options that we could have deployed in Syria after the chemical weapons incident, and he is the one who said no. So it's his decision, and despite advice he got from the bureaucracy.
Thank you.
I think there are 2 or 3 other points where on the trust aspect, where the northern GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Kuwait, will be more reluctant than the southern Gulf countries of Oman, the Emirates, and, say, Qatar, to enter into a further trusting geopolitical, even bilateral relationship with Iran on political issues. 2 summers ago, Iranian sleeper cells were uncovered in Kuwait. Iranian sleeper cells were uncovered in Bahrain. It was discovered under interrogation that the 2 cells were coordinated from Iran. The Saudi Arabian file on residents of its eastern province going to Syria or Najaf or Karbala and elsewhere to be trained or controlled or become agents or supporters or sympathizers or sleepers for Iran. Those files have to be closed. If they remain open, I see no likelihood of those 3, and they constitute half of the GCC, being in favor of a closer political relationship with Iran. The economic and the commercial one, no, that's in a separate category. And those in Dubai and Oman and elsewhere are indeed benefiting from that dynamic of the relationship. But that's quite different than the geopolitical and the political one.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think what I'll do is basically ask a big, long, 3-part question, which I've got 3 cards in front of me, but basically it revolves around what would the GCC states need to hear to consider this summit a success? And what might its diplomatic consequences be of its failure? How did the Saudi government affect the proceedings of the nuclear deal? How might these discussions have an impact on that? And how is the proposed nuclear deal viewed from the Gulf? And I think what we'll do is just start from that side and work our way across. If that would be okay with everybody. And then we'll sort of do a quick wrap up if you wanted to say a few words at the end. President,
Well, first of all, the meeting is going to happen, and despite whatever the naysayers are saying, I think it's going to be positive, at least because they're meeting. At least there will be an opportunity for airing differences, discussing some issues, and there are a lot of technical and overall geostrategic issues that need to be discussed, or at least touched on, so to speak. But I honestly don't think that the present administration is in any mood to extend the overall issue of signing really defense treaties with the GCC, or dealing with them as if they are NATO allies, so to speak. Unfortunately, but what the administration will do what the administration can do. Remember that the United States foreign policy in the Middle East is actually domestic policy, United States domestic policy, and it reflects on a lot of issues, especially the Israeli thing. They, however, will definitely, there probably will be some new extension of weapons sales, some shipments, some agreement on some really advanced intelligence gathering, and probably I don't think the F-35 is in the cards yet. I think it's just way too early to talk about that.
On the nuclear issue, I'd say the two sides of that coin are proliferation issues and ensuring that Iran doesn't build a nuclear weapon. The flip side of that coin is safety issues. What happens if there's an earthquake in Bushehr? And, what would happen if something that happened in Chernobyl in the 80s or in Fukushima a few years ago happens in Iran, and it's right on the Gulf, and all these Arab countries are sitting there? That is not a proliferation issue. That's a safety issue, and that's what Iran and all of its sea neighbors have in common to initiate, especially because the Emirates are going nuclear in a couple of years with Korean help, South Korean help, to have some kind of a Gulf-wide nuclear safety initiative that is about the proper management of nuclear facilities, because these countries are so close together geographically speaking.
Well, I'd rather to go back to the energy topic related to that. If there is any deal, of course, it's going to be an effect on Iran's oil production. Currently, particularly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait took Iran's market share, the part that Iran lost, and they have successfully signed long-term sale agreement with their partners. So for at least next year, we're going to have an oversupply because Saudi and Kuwait have a term agreement for supplying crude oil to their customers. Iranian crude oil is going to be in the market, so they could start, of course, negotiations. OPEC would be the first ground to start the energy talks, and then there is the issue of investment. Iraq has a lot of potential for crude oil increased production. However, it doesn't have gas. So Iran has huge resources of gas. So Qatar does, but Qatar again has contracts, and all of its natural gas for some good amount of years is already committed. So Iran's gas could be a solution to many of energy problems and challenges of its neighboring countries. But again, for any, at least gas deal, which is totally different with oil sale, it's a very long-term commitment. There will be a need for solving this mistrust and those issues that they have, at least to a certain degree, that both sides would be able to start it.
Well,
Well, I think there's a clear realization among the GCC states that we're not going to solve all the problems at the summit meeting. It definitely is a good opportunity for the GCC leaderships. They're going to have Obama's attention for a whole day. They're going to be able to talk to him directly. And they're going to want to hear from him personally also the specifics on the nuclear deal. And I think there are two aspects that are going to be important. One is, what is the United States going to be ready to do in case Iran doesn't stick to the deal in the end? If they're caught cheating down the road, what happens? What measures is the United States ready then to impose in that cases? And second, what happens after 10 years, 10 or 15 years, whatever the final agreement will be? What's then going to happen to the nuclear issue? Because there is that concern that you get to 10 years and then suddenly Iran is just free to do whatever it wants. I think they want to have a clear signal that even after 10 years, a nuclear program will not be allowed. I think that's going to be important. And of course, they're going to want to hear very clearly what the U.S. strategy is in terms of countering Iranian asymmetric activities in the region. But again, this is part of a process. They're going to be here to listen. But I think, over time, still there is that issue of not being sure that, the rhetoric is going to match the action in the end of the day. So the jury is going to be out on do they have the feeling that the president is really listening to their concerns, and B, is he going down the road actually implement and then do something about his concerns? And there we have to see, the judgment will still be out.
I agree with Christian about the nuclear issue, so I won't repeat what he said, and picking up on what he said about the other issue. I think what they'd like to hear, and I'm not sure they will hear it, but what they'd like to hear is, how do we define the word attack? If we are going to assure them that we are going to be there for them when they are attacked, does that mean only when there is a conventional assault against them, which I don't expect to occur? Or does it mean that, or do we understand that Iran would have the capability to foment an action inside their country that could destabilize the regime? And do we define the word attack to include that? And would we be there for them in such an occasion? And by the way, they're a little concerned about the interview that Obama gave to Tom Friedman when he spoke about the greatest threat to them being from their own populations rather than from Iran, because that signals to them that we would not be there for them if, for example, an Iranian militia in Iraq got in business with some people inside Kuwait and did something inside Kuwait that subverted the regime.
I'll turn it over.
Just a few final comments here pertaining to the summit. Summits are always important, and this one in particular because of its participants. This is not North Korea. This is not the eastern end of the Mediterranean. This is a place that has more than half of all the world's known proven hydrocarbon energy resources that are the trigger, the engine that drives the global economy. So any meeting of representatives of 6 countries that line the entire western side of this waterway is bound to have strategic significance. But the media, of course, has an interest in fanning tensions or creating tensions, or if it bleeds, it leads, etc. So if one focuses only on the media, what one will lose sight of is the following. that the U.S. relationship with these 6 countries is multifaceted. It's strong and it's long in terms of legs. This is the 70th year of the historic meeting between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz, February 14, 1945. But from that meeting, people have inferred and derived very misleading lessons. There's a consensus in this city, in the Congress, in the executive branch that, all right, there was a bargain there, a grand bargain, that America would provide security, defense for Saudi Arabia in exchange for unlimited, massive amounts of this hydrocarbon fuels. And no doubt that America's unrivaled position in terms of its material well-being globally through Saudi Aramco has had a direct linkage to low-cost energy and compared to all other countries. America's GDP is abundant evidence for that. However, the misleading part of that is that the 2 pieces of it are inanimate. A thing, namely energy, in exchange for another thing, military might. That's not the glue or the cement or the lubricant of the relationship. It's something quite different. And it's more profound and multifaceted and pervasive than that. One has to go back to the 1920s when doctors from Bahrain sailed over to Saudi Arabia and stayed a week and treated people with all kinds of diseases and ailments and illnesses. And they asked for nothing in return. And they did this over and over and over year-round and into the 30s, to the point where King Abdulaziz asked, who are these Americans? Because that behavior was so different from that of the British and that of the French, who had imperial images in America, did not. And so from that perception of the people-to-people dynamic of the relationship came King Abdulaziz's favorable, positive bias in favor of an American petroleum company being granted a long-term concession for petroleum exploration. And that's the story. That's the glue. That's the adhesive of the relationship. And you have something like 200,000 American university graduates in Saudi Arabia. And since 1975, there have been more American-trained PhDs in Saudi Arabia's cabinet than PhDs of any kind in the American cabinet, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the House of Representatives combined. And even now you have more than 100,000 Saudi Arabian students in the United States, and they are Shia among them. And a large percentage of them are women as well. These things do not come through in the media or the press conferences or the communiques at the end of summits. But the relationship, not just with Saudi Arabia, but with Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, and Oman, is this multifaceted, strategic on issues of war and peace, economic in terms of what drives the global economies, political in terms of the issues of the day and votes in the United Nations Security Councils, and active or inactive or serious or marginally serious peace processes. They're the defense cooperation dynamics. The United States has 4 defense cooperation agreements with the GCC countries, and these came after the Kuwait crisis of 1991. And even older, access to facilities agreement since Oman entered into it after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But people say, well, we don't have one with Saudi Arabia, and that's a major omission. Here's where one has to be careful of not confusing form with function. No, there is no defense cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia. But the defense relationship with Saudi Arabia, the training, the munitions, the arms transfers, the commonness of strategic doctrine, of interoperability ability of the education of political military dynamics and relations dwarfs that of all of the other 5 countries that do have defense cooperation agreements there. So the relationship is stronger than the atmospheric surrounding this summit would imply or suggest. And those who work the issues on a day-to-day basis know this. There's no massive grounds for grave concern that the relationship is teetering and tottering, and that one or the other side is weak and wavering and pondering withdrawal. No, this relationship is the envy of every other country in the world. And I welcome debating anybody who disagrees with that. We thank you for coming to help add these issues and to have a divergence of viewpoint and analysis and assessment and an estimation of where this relationship is, where it's been, and where it's heading. Thank you for coming.